my name is Tony Hewitt. I am neither an economist nor am I a financier, but I'm concerned about the ongoing collapse of the Western economy and the loss of our democratic system. I'm not sure that people really understand what's going on in England, Europe, the United States, and to a lesser degree in Canada. I certainly do not understand everything about it, but I do understand some of it, and I want to share what I know with the rest of you. A social disaster is developing throughout the Western world. More and more people can neither find work nor feed their families. Many are beginning to lose hope, and too many have become homeless. These social tragedies are developing because the political and financial leadership in the West has abdicated its responsibility to serve the public, and under the guise of managing our affairs, they are acting on their own behalf. They are fanning the flames of discontent and chaos so they can justify their own management agenda. And they've been doing that ever since they decided to cause the collapse of the Western economy in order to create the New World Order. In 1974, the United States invited senior financial officials from the other G5 group of nations, the United Kingdom, West Germany, Japan and France, to begin talks at the White House Library in Washington, D.C. Two-thirds of their populations were about to retire, causing a major demographic transition. This would have left their governments with a smaller workforce, a smaller tax base, and a lot more retirement benefit checks to issue every month. These future circumstances led the Library Group to believe that their economies might fail. They discussed these problems over a long period of time, but they were unable to come to any other conclusion. Consequently, they were unable to find a solution to what they saw as a developing financial and economic nightmare. Sometime in the late 1970s or the early 1980s, members of the Library Group informed their respective governments that their economies would fail within the first half of the new century. At best, the Library Group's conclusions were based on incomplete information. However, their conclusions terrified the political and financial leadership of the day because they and their predecessors had already spent a lot of the retirement funds on social programs they could ill afford and lavish lifestyles to which they were not entitled. The G5 group of countries decided to take control of their populations and transfer the major wealth of their economies to new markets in China, India, South Africa, Brazil and Mexico. Once that had been accomplished, they intended to manage their economies down and then start over without the social programs. They developed a 25 to 30-year management program which they have administered and expanded throughout the last 29 years. Today, you and I are witnessing the economies of England, Europe and the United States in the final stages of their managed collapse. I found out about this deceptive ruse on February 14, 1982, during an after-dinner conversation with two attorneys. And although I know whom they are, for now I shall refer to them by their Christian names alone. The relevant part of our conversation follows. Jim Attorney. The groups over at the AG's office have been asked to look at how to transfer the wealth of the West to the East. The decision to make the transfer around the turn of the century has already been agreed to, but they still don't know how they're going to accomplish it or to whom the money will go, although both China and India are looking pretty good at the moment. Tom Attorney. Who has made the decision? Jim Attorney. Oh, you know, the usual suspects, the royals and others like them. They had no choice, really. They had to do something, otherwise the whole thing was going to go down the toilet anyway. They've been discussing it in secret over at the White House Library for years, but they haven't been able to find any other solution. Too many of us are going to be retiring, and over the years the governments have spent a lot of the retirement funds on social programs they could ill afford. Let's face it, too many of us have been at the trough for too long. It's too bad, really. They've known for years that this day was coming, and now it's time to pay the piper. Of course, they can't tell the public, otherwise they'd have a rebellion on their hands. Before they could transfer the wealth of their economies to the emerging markets of China, India, South Africa, Brazil and Mexico, Western governments had to neutralize the power of the democratic vote. Otherwise, they would have been committing an illegal act. In Canada, the government created the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The document placed the civil affairs of all Canadians inside the court system as collective rights. Then, the government and its judiciary decided that the most important thing inside a courtroom would no longer be the truth or the facts or the merits or the law. The most important thing would be how one presented a case. Prior to the Charter, Canadians walked around with their individual civil rights attached to them. If a Canadian appeared in court on a civil, family, or criminal court matter, the court was obligated, in law, to make sure that citizens' civil rights were being protected within the proceeding. Not anymore. The Charter allowed Canadians to live in a free and open society, but the government's obligation to provide services on an individual basis became obsolete. Since the Charter was signed, the government's only obligation to the public has been to look after the public purse. Many services that they used to provide, they now sell or provide on a more limited basis. Canadians are no longer being served. We are being managed. The United States and deregulation. There are those who argue that deregulation did not cause the financial collapse in 2008 or the recession that followed. However, I think it fair and reasonable to suggest that deregulation did create the environment wherein the financial collapse was able to take place. Furthermore, the leadership of the day must have known the risk they were taking by removing the rules and regulations from the financial institutions. It is ludicrous and fanciful to think otherwise, given the desire and the ability of some to always take advantage of others. That is why we had the rules and regulations in the first place, and everybody knew that. Rules and regulations are one of the foundations of a civil society. When they are removed, chaos ensues. A look at deregulation and the United States presidency. James Earl Jimmy Carter Jr. served as the 39th President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. He deregulated the beer industry, the trucking industry, and the airline industry. He was also responsible for beginning deregulatory reform in railroads, telephones, natural gas, and, most importantly, banking. Ronald Reagan served as the 40th President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. He appointed his Vice President, George Herbert Walker Bush, to chair two special task forces on deregulation and international drug smuggling. The Deregulation Task Force reviewed hundreds of rules, making specific recommendations on which ones to amend or revise in order to curb the size of the federal government. During Reagan's presidency in 1983, a program was initiated within the U.S. intelligence community to ensure America's economic strength. The Socrates Project, from its inception, had a twofold mission. First was to determine the true underlying cause of the U.S. declining competitiveness. Second was to use this understanding to develop the means to rebuild America's competitiveness. To ensure the United States acquired the maximum benefit from the project, President Reagan, during his second term, had an executive order drafted to create a new federal agency to implement the Project Socrates results on a nationwide basis. However, President Reagan's term came to end before the executive order could be coordinated and signed, and the incoming Bush administration, labeling Project Socrates as industrial policy, had it terminated. Excuse me. In the December 16, 2010 edition of the CPA Trade Reform, in an article titled Socrates Project, Michael Sikora, the Socrates Project director, said, "The Socrates Project utilized all source intelligence and, by examining competition worldwide, determined that the United States and its organizations had begun losing competitive advantage in the marketplace after World War II, as a result of switching from technology-based planning to economic-based planning as the foundation of most decision-making. Socrates also foresaw that if the United States continued to rely upon economic-based planning with its inherent degradation of competitive advantage, the economic health of the United States would go into catastrophic freefall, and no amount of economic maneuvering would be able to stop it. George Herbert Walker Bush he served as the 41st President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. Foreign policy drove the Bush presidency, military operations were conducted in Panama and the Persian Gulf at a time of world change. He does not appear to have made use of the vast amount of knowledge he accumulated as chair of the Deregulation Committee during his term as Vice President under President Reagan. William Jefferson Bill Clinton served as the 42nd President of the United States from 1993 to 2001. He continued deregulation of the financial markets with his Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. It is United States federal legislation that officially ensured the deregulation of financial products known as over-the-counter derivatives. These derivatives, especially the credit default swap, would be at the very heart of the financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent Great Recession. George Walker Bush served as the 43rd President of the United States from 2001 to 2008. In a February 28, 2001 message to Congress, President George Bush estimated there would be a $5.6 trillion surplus over the next 10 years. Facing opposition in Congress, Bush held town hall-style public meetings across the United States in 2001 to increase public support for his plan for a $1.35 trillion tax cut program, one of the largest tax cuts in U.S. history. Bush argued that unspent government funds should be returned to taxpayers, saying the surplus is not the government's money, the surplus is the people's money. With reports of the threat of recession from Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, Bush argued that such a tax cut would stimulate the economy and create jobs. Others, including the Treasury Secretary at the time, Paul O'Neill, were opposed to some of the tax cuts on the basis that they would contribute to budget deficits and undermine Social Security. President George Bush then fought his war in Iraq, largely on credit and whilst the housing crisis was in its inchoate stage. The war in Iraq had nothing to do with the attack on the Twin Towers. Aside from the horrendous loss of life, the attack on the Twin Towers was a financial hit, and the war had everything to do with further weakening the American economy. 4 of these 5 presidents, between them, laid the foundation for the housing crisis. The ninja mortgages, along with the worldwide Wall Street brokerage and insurance scam, accomplished exactly what they were designed to do. They devastated the financial markets throughout the Western world, and that could not have happened without a lot of our cooperation at a very senior level. The removal of the checks and balances from the financial marketplace, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the ninja mortgage housing crisis, along with their brokerage and insurance game, the bailouts for Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the enormous $700 billion bank bailout, along with all the other bailouts, had a purpose. They were not separate acts that had nothing to do with each other. They were a series of coordinated events designed to accomplish 3 goals. The first goal, to transfer the wealth of the West to China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, has already been accomplished to a large degree. The second and third goals, to manage the Western economies down and to destroy the democratic system, are happening as I write this document. Italy has recently accepted a president and a cabinet to develop and watch over their economic austerity measures over the next 3 years, without the benefit of an election. They are testing the boundaries of democracy. They are determining what they can get away with and what they cannot get away with. And we are allowing them to do it. The American corporation Cisco's chairman, Mr. John Grisham, said on November the 10th, 2011, that his company gets charged a 35% tax if it returns its offshore profits to the United States. Consequently, Cisco Corporation has $3.5 billion worth of assets in the United States and $48 billion worth of assets offshore. Mr. Grisham also said that he would love to bring back those offshore assets to create jobs in the United States. Here is a case of the US government deliberately inhibiting the development of its own economy while promoting the economies of the emerging markets. Now multiply that by thousands. Where do you think the emerging markets have gotten their funds to emerge? The leadership in Europe created the euro to convert Europe's different currencies into one. This made it easier for the European political and financial leadership to create the chaotic situation that European finance has become. Now the G20, which is what the G5 has become, are pretending to manage and fix the problems that they have created. Today, the leadership of the United States and Europe are talking about how they're going to repair the damage to their respective economies and how they're going to create jobs for their populations. And most importantly, why it is that they cannot do either. They are making it look like they are going to do one thing while they are accomplishing something else entirely. This positive force, bait and switch presentation of case program that has gone on for nearly 30 years is an attack upon the civil rights of every citizen in England, Europe and North America, and it is going to devastate our collective social, cultural and human experience. I encourage everyone to protest, but do so without the violence. Get your churches involved, get organized, and remember Jesus of Nazareth, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Let what they stood for guide your endeavors. I thank you for listening, and goodbye.